Okay, in this video, I'm going to go over some random features that are in my current setup for my still life. So I have this still life render right here. My main hero asset is this backpack that I made for a previous assignment, and I textured some of these assets, including this vase and these papers, to kind of fill it out, because most people doing this project are going to have multiple objects. I wanted to kind of go over a few like tricks that you could look into for lighting. So I have some lighting and camera stuff. I have some set dressing stuff and material and shader um, additions to this scene that hopefully make it look a little bit more realistic. First, I'm going to talk about the backpack. So the backpack's pretty straightforward. All of my settings are just carefully tuned from my texture maps coming from Substance Painter. My main recommendation, I repeat this many times, and I'll repeat it here, that dialing in the displacement in normal maps is something that should be done gently. So normally when you bring in your texture maps for the first time um, into Substance Painter and you just leave your default material properties, your Pixar displacement, so let's go ahead and just do this. Oh, actually I don't have displacement on the body of mine. So you can see I disabled it. But anywhere where I do have a displacement, a lot of times, okay, in this case, I'm doing one, but certain objects, what I'm going to have to do is I usually dial it down. And I do the same thing with the normal map too. In this case, this is not helping because in these cases, I actually left it alone for these, which sometimes works. There's definitely some of my objects like this pot. I dialed in the displacement, brought it a little lower because it was way too high and it was pushing too hard. So usually that's like the first technical hurdle I think most people rendering with RenderMan from Substance Painter run into is you get all your shaders and everything plugged in, and then your default settings for the normal maps and displacement map is really, really strong. Okay. The second thing about the backpack is I'm actually using XGen. So you can kind of see it here. So I have this like little fuzzy, I have some rendering artifacts. That's why it's like showing up as little pops of white. But you can see, and if you compare it to this one, right, here's without XGen and here's with XGen. And so you can see I'm doing it for the little leather tears, but also some fabric pilling. And that's just using XGen. I'm not going to go over XGen in here, but uh, this setup is pretty straightforward as far as XGen goes. So you can see here's the hairs right there. I turn on anti-aliasing because sometimes it's hard to see it. And you can see I just did these like kind of short random curly Q dudes. And so all I have is a noise and a coil, which kind of give them a little bit of randomization. Um, the, the most complicated part of this XGen setup is just the fact that I'll use random values. So I the basic rand value. So if I come over here, I think I have one right here, is rand and then a number range from min to max. And so it's just going to return for each of these hairs, it's going to give you a slightly randomized value between those ranges. So it depends on the setting, right? Like I'm not always going to use rand 0 to 1. So you can see in here, tilt U, V, and N. Essentially, what that does and around in is it just like rotates and tilts the hairs without bending them. So that's just to get them to like kind of sometimes lay flat, sometimes point in a different direction randomly. Um, and so I just played with the settings of the slider to figure out where the bounds were, and then just replaced the slider with an expression by clicking on this button and then typing in. And so I won't again. I don't want to go too deep into XGen, but if you're just writing a single line like on these ones, you don't have to set any variables. All you have to do is just write a function rand and that. Um, for my length value, you can see I do have a slightly more complicated setup where I have a height value that I like. And then what I'm doing is I'm multiplying that height value by a multiplier. So either it's 80% or 120%. So multiplying 0.8 will give me 80% of that, and multiplying by 1.2 will give me 120% of that. And then I'm using this function called stray, which is this essentially, this may look like foreign language to you, but essentially this is just saying, is the hair a stray hair, labeled as a stray hair? If so, then do this. If not, then do this. So I just have it so that all my stray hairs will be 3 times as long, so I can get some extra random one or long ones randomly. Um, and the stray part is something you define up here with descriptions, and I just set it to 10%. But yeah, that was really, really quick. Nothing special there. Um, One thing to keep an eye out for is to always make sure you assign a shader and you set it to render with RenderMan, and set the percent to 100 if you're not having it show up. Another thing I wanted to mention is that the I'll switch to XPU in a second, but uh, XPU is essentially a new rendering option for RenderMan where you can render with the CPU and GPU of your computer at the same time instead of just the CPU. So it speeds up rendering very quickly, but the problem is not everything is functional in it. So the thing I noticed, or I haven't been able to figure out yet, is that XGen disappears in XPU. So I left it as RIS for now, so that I could show this in an example. Okay, next I'm going to cover some of the set dressing stuff. So I just have a simple ground material with I mean, simple in terms of the shader parameters are pretty straightforward, straight from Substance Painter with some displacement. And, that displacement adds a lot of depth and three-dimensionality to it. One thing you might notice is that there are these leaves scattered on there. And another thing is, this one's a little bit harder to see, but there's these little curves. They're essentially little hairs, and at a higher resolution, they show up a lot better. But these are essentially like dust curves and hair. And so I implemented both of those in here. So if I come in here, you can see here's all the little curls that I scattered, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then here, there's a couple leaves on here, but you'll notice not all the leaves are there, right? So it only looks like there's like 4 leaves or 5 leaves, but there's clearly more of those. So some of these leaves are actually leaf cards that I just took a leaf material and then cut a little plane around them and then plop them and set dress them, right? That's where they're kind of like just laying around here. And then the other ones that are, you can see that are like more flat, they're essentially attached as a texture map. So I have my ground layer, which has the wood material, and then I have a second, essentially a duplicate of that I just shifted up a little bit. And then I gave it this material that has transparency. And we can go look at that over in Substance Painter. I don't have the same setup already, but I lost the file. So I just set it up again. So here's just like kind of like a simulation. So let's say this is the same object I was using inside of Substance Painter, or sorry, Maya for the ground. And I was going to add the leaves on top. So this is using what's called an atlas. You don't have to use an atlas. You can use images you find online. You can make your own texture maps. This is one that I had in my Adobe library. But essentially, what an atlas is just like packing a bunch of texture maps into one set of texture maps, right? So there's one diffuse color, and on that diffuse color map, there's this many leaves, and so this generator or this I'm not sure what you would call it. This material has a bunch of presets, so you can change between the way that they're scattering, and you can also change. So let's see, parameters preset. So obviously I can change like the leaves and how they're being applied. Different setups. You can see there's also this mode selection. So there's default, which is going to have like this grid uh, and like that. And then you have a single element. So that's essentially going to take just a single part of that image. Let's just hide that for a second because it's getting annoying. And then we have splatter, which is going to scatter the asset around for you, which you can change like what leaves it uses, right? And so there's min max. And so this one has probably, I think, like 12. So I could just set it from 0 to 12. There's some randomization. So if you wanted to add a little bit of randomization to it, you can. You can all these different material settings. So this is it's a pre-made material from Substance Designer, and so it has all these different functions to it. But being able to scatter and splat it onto the model and being able to control those settings can be really helpful. And one of the crucial parts that are implied or applied to this, and the way that it works in my scene is that I have transparency, right? Because I want this to be floating on top, right? So it casts shadows and it doesn't fall in the cracks and things like that. If it was part of the same mesh as the wood, then we'd get like some ugly kind of like connections here, and I wouldn't be able to like get a cast shadow underneath the leaf. So in order to do that, what I did was I came into my file and I set up my file with a default ASM. So when we did the project setup, and you do file new, and I brought my file in, I just did the basic ASM PBR metallic rough. And it doesn't have an opacity setting. So the opacity is what gives me that alpha cutout. So you can see here, if I come over texture set settings, these are all my default ones, but I can add a new one up here because I have Adobe Standard Material as my project setting. And I'm going to click on this button right here called opacity, and we'll add it there. We'll come over here and we'll make sure that we enable opacity on this layer. It already is. And you might notice that it still isn't working. And that's because the display settings isn't set up to handle, it's either display settings or render settings. I always get them mixed up, or shader settings. Okay, it's shader settings. So if I come in here, you can see opacity. If I turn on enable alpha test, now you can see that there is now an alpha cutout. It doesn't look very pretty, but it's there. There is in this setting here, so if I come over to that shader setting, this alpha threshold, so that is just going to be choosing a grayscale value or white value on your alpha map to essentially shrink and grow. And this is just display purposes in Substance Painter, right? That's not going to translate over to RenderMan. This is just for us to be able to see it. But if you do notice there's that white edge when you bring it into RenderMan or whatever package, then you might have to shrink the mask on the alpha transparency. So if I look at my color channels, right, here's my color, height, roughness, you can see that's also showing up transparent, normal, and then my opacity, which is just a black and white map. And so that's how I'm able to get this on top of the other image, or on top of the other plane, and it looks like they're like sitting on top or floating on top. Okay, for the plane cards, or sorry, the leaf cards, the single ones, what I did was I just created a plane. I kept it pretty simple. I didn't add a lot of subdivisions, and I exported that out. Then inside of um, here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and find that model, which I called, what did I call it? Flat plane. There we go. I'm going to set it to my OpenGL. Say OK. And then we're just going to say project has been modified. Nope, don't care about that. All right. And so then what I can do here is I can essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to export a flat texture. So I just really need the color map for now, but I'm going to export all the texture maps using that same Atlas technique. Or again, if you find you can make your texture maps on a flat plane and make your own. But let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and find that leaf atlas. So I have this small common laurel leaves. I'm going to drag it on the plane. And instead of doing the default, what I'm going to do is do a single element. And I am going to make sure that my project is set up to use opacity. It doesn't really matter if I turn on the opacity for now. I can go ahead and do that. Mostly I just want to make sure that it's going to export out the opacity map for me. And so if I didn't have that material channel, then it wouldn't show up. So anyways, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and file export selection, or export textures, sorry. And I'm just going to go ahead and choose my project location. So we're going to go over here. I have my texture maps, leaves. I'm going to create a new folder called solo leaf. Select that. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're just going to use a RenderMan. So just using basic RenderMan Pixar surface. One thing, if you're ever doing like new material attributes that aren't in your default, so if you're not using like just specular roughness, diffuse color, displacement, and normal map, and you start adding some other things like clear coat or anisotropy, they don't output by default. So if you come over here to the templates, you can see where all the texture maps are going. So you find them over here and see if they have a texture assigned to them. or an image output. So you can see the opacity image is being outputted to this to be called the presence, which is what RenderMan uses for opacity. That's the term it uses. So you can see like I don't have any clear coat or anisotropy export settings for this layout. You can see I made my own version, which is pretty easy. You just duplicate these and then you can create a new one of these dudes by just clicking this up here. But you can see for my coat, I went ahead and added the coat normal to its own RGB image output and just gave it a name. Opacity, I called it coat mask. And then coat roughness, I just called it coat roughness. And so just keep that in mind if you're ever like, I need this subsurface scattering texture map, but none of these presets for RenderMan are exporting it. That you usually just have to add that yourself, and then it's pretty easy once you do it. So you can see I've set up something specifically for displacement, because by default the Pixar surface, you can see this displacement. By default, it exports your height map as a displacement. But the problem for me is when I think through it ahead of time, I like to have displacement separate from my normal maps. And so my normal maps usually come from the height channel, right? You do most of your work in the height channel to get all the surface detail. And then that gets baked down by default into both your displacement and your normal map. So you're getting kind of like the same information twice. So for the really big changes, I actually set displacement manually. And then for the normal surface details, smaller ones, then I would just leave as height. And so that's what I did for this displacement is my normal map you can see is this converted right here, which essentially behind the scenes, you can see it says converted. It's converting your height map and your normal maps into one combined normal map. And you can see instead my displacement is grabbing from the displacement channel. So I'm just using that. Okay, so I export this out. Let's go ahead and get that set up inside of my. All right, so here I'm going to do is I'm going to assign a new material, and I'm just going to go ahead and use Maya blend, sure. And then for this guy, I'm going to go ahead and find the attribute editor, find the material. We're going to go ahead and, oh, this one's interesting. Okay, let me go ahead and assign just the default. Okay, let's just do Lambert because I don't want to mess with that. Okay, so we're going to attach a texture map to this guy. I'll just bring in a file. This isn't meant for rendering. This is just so I can see the image on it. So we're going to go texture maps. We're going to go leaves, solo leaf. We're going to find all images or all files. Oh, let me go and make sure I export my textures. All right, there we go. I just forgot to export. So I'm just going to click on the presence and you can see it's this black and white map. We can either use that. I might just use the diffuse so I can see it. So we're just going to go ahead and add that. I'm going to turn on texturing in the viewport so I can see this. And then this is actually going to be really straightforward. All I'm really going to do is I'm just going to use multi-cut. So what I'm going to do is it'd be probably even easier if I didn't have these edge loops here. So we're just going to select this and this. I'm going to do Control Delete, which deletes the vertices and the edge loop. I'm going to go ahead and draw a center line just through this guy, just to make it simpler. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and draw an outline around this guy. And I don't have to be perfect with everything. All I really need to do is I need to make sure that I am covering the entire object. And I could do this like if you have a bunch of leaf variations. So I'm only doing this for one leaf, but I could do it for like 4 or 5 different leaves and just have different leaf shapes that match the texture map. But you know, I would probably need to make these a little bit bigger just to accommodate for if there's like a leaf that's a little bit wider and it goes off. But let me go ahead and just finish this off. So we're just going to come in here. I think I'm definitely did not count my vertices and where I'm at, and you can see I'm kind of getting a little too far away. If you find that you want to make this like a little bit snugger, you can see when I move this, you'll notice the texture's not moving. That's not the default behavior. So there's a setting right here. Oh, it shouldn't be moving. But there's a setting right here called preserve UVs. And so that lets you move your model and it's not going to move or you can move vertices and edge loops and it's going to try to keep the UVs the same relative to where they were originally. So I'm just going to make sure that it captures the whole thing. I can see that I have like this little floating, guy right here. So I'm going to move him down, over. All right. So now I'm going to just go ahead and turn this into quads. So I'm just going to come here. Oops. Go there. right click to turn or to complete. Okay, and then we're just going to do this. Okay, and this is not quad, so I'm just going to drop a vert there and a vert there. So this is essentially all I'll have to do for my card. If I want a little bit more, the ability to essentially have more deformation on it, then I'm probably going to just go ahead and take this and just go edit mesh, add divisions. So we're just going to do that. And then what I can do is I can go ahead and I can curl things, right? So maybe I want to go ahead and take all these guys. Let's go ahead and turn off the preserve UVs. I'll turn on a little soft select. It's not very high. Oops. It's not very high res, so the soft select's not going to be super noticeable. But so if I want to like cup the leaf edges or something like that, or I could use a deformer. So if you come over to deform, you can go to nonlinear deformers down here. And there's all kinds. There's twisting and bending is usually what I would use on this case. So it creates this handle. You usually try to line it up with the objects. It will just hold J for snapping rotation. And I'll just rotate that like that. And then we can try playing with the settings. And so usually I'll just play around with this a little bit to get the setting I like and the look I like. And so I want these to feel like dried, curled. You can see they all have like a slight curl or twist to them, right? Another one I like to add on is the bend deformer. So it's going to be the same idea. Let's go ahead and add a bend deformer. I'm going to rotate that. And then we're just going to turn on curvature. You can see it's still not rotating the right way, so we're just going to do it that way. And I can, have the, if I only want the bend to be happening up here, I can change that higher upper bound or lower bound, sorry, lower bound. So if I bring the lower bound there, then I can just get that curl up there. You can see it's really limited by how many subdivisions I have. So if I wanted like a smoother curve, I can do that. I can also make sure that I'm using smooth preview or a subdivision scheme. So if I'm in RenderMan, I can add a subdivision scheme by coming in here and doing that. So it subdivides at render time. But yeah, and then if you want to like so you'll notice if you move the model around, the deformer is like not moving with it. So if you want to move them together and keep them together, you can do that. You can group them together. You can parent them. If you want to apply the effect of the deformer permanently to the model, then you just select the model and you say edit delete by type history. You'll see the deformer handles disappears. And so now that it's baked into the geometry, so it's permanently that shape. And so I did I think I did like 2 or 3 leaves, and I just did them in another file. I didn't, I just opened a new Maya file, did exactly that process, and I had all my texture maps. And so when I export the texture maps, just keep in mind, I have all of those texture maps already exported. I was just using the color map to like get the shape. And then once I was done with that, then I would actually add a Pixar surface, attach my texture maps like normal, and then I just essentially place them around in my scene so that they kind of broke up the really flat appearance of these, right? So the normal map and displacement of those really helps to make them feel a little bit more dimensional, but they were still feeling super flat. So I just went ahead and dropped on those hero cards, as I call them, or solo leaves. Similarly, I kind of use deformers as well on this leaf. So if I come over here, let's see, and let's turn on defaults, turn off texturing. Okay. So there's this paper right here, and it actually has 2 deformers on it as well, so that I could essentially get it to curl up against this bag. Because a lot of times when you get, it's really easy to do deformers on like simple objects like planes, but you can even do them on things like you want to squash a model, or you want to reshape this really complex piece of geometry, doing something like a lattice deformer, right? Which is kind of like a giant sculpting soft selects kind of thing. So we're just going to go ahead and grab this lattice point. We can turn on soft select and then move it. Oop. All right. Oh, it's stuck on that for some reason. There we go. And so that lets me like, like if I wanted to, kind of shrink the top and just like kind of make it narrower on top. So now I have like a narrower bowl. Um, so there's a lot of power here where you have a bunch of objects or you have things you modeled, and instead of like baking in or editing or modeling things like normal, you can use deformers to make things like change shape a little bit more organically and naturally. Okay, next I'm going to show these curves. And so um, this is an effect that might be a little hard to kind of see, but when I do like a high res render, like maybe a 2K render, and maybe if I like change and increase the density of these little curves, then I can maybe have something that feels a little bit more prominent. But you can see there's like these little tiny curves that are on there, and I think right now the effect is a little too subtle. But essentially, this one is I'm actually scattering things. So in this case, I'm scattering curves. So what I actually ended up using was something called Bifrost. So Bifrost is a plugin that you can enable through the settings and plugin manager. It's usually installed by default with Maya. If you disabled that when you were installing, you might not have it installed by default. You can access the Bifrost by going to Windows, and then you can see Bifrost browser and graph editor. And I'm pretty sure the browser is going to have a bunch of presets, so it's going to have a bunch of different preset projects that you can download, and you can or settings that you can look at and play around with. So there might be things in here that so there's a bunch of scattering settings or default template projects, so you can try those just to read through them. So what I did was I went ahead and just went to, let's go to Windows, Bifrost Graph Editor. And so in my outliner, I have a Bifrost graph, and I don't actually know if I can bring it in here, but let's see. There we go. So normally you could go up and create a new graph, and essentially there's going to be better videos out there for learning how Bifrost works. I spent maybe 15 to 20 minutes watching a tutorial on how to do it, and I definitely am not using the full advantage or fully understand everything, but I got enough to get what I was going for. So essentially the main idea is that I have these dust curves. So I just modeled a couple little NURBS curves inside of Maya with some like randomized like curling and coiling and bending, just to have a little variety. And then what I did was I went ahead and imported those in. So you can see these, all of these right here are those curves, right? And then I also am bringing in my ground plane. So I'm scattering them on my ground plane. And so then I'm using these nodes like, and to bring those in, all I really did was just middle mouse click and drag them into here, click and drag them on. And then they come in as little node imports. And so I'm just plugging this node into scatter. And this is where a lot of the settings for how dense or how many there are goes. There's this randomized point rotation and randomized point scale. So by default, it's going to come in, if I use a scatter by number random, it's going to be randomly placed, but they're not going to have randomized sizes or rotation. So we use this randomized point rotation and just played around with these settings. Scale, same thing, just played around with the scale a bit. And then this node right here is the one that goes ahead and creates that scattering of these objects onto this plane. So this plane, by running it through this like scatter by number randomized points, all it's doing is it's just generating a bunch of points on the model. And then this setting right here, create instances, I'm taking the points and I'm assigning models to them. And then it's essentially going to randomize the selection between all of my curves for each point, and it's just going to replace them on the model. So I'm using this ground shape and scatter so I can get this surface of this ground plane, so everything will scatter across this ground plane right here. And then I'm using the curve objects to swap out and change those objects. And then one thing you'll have to do is, it helps if you do this ahead of time, I actually did it afterwards, is I'm rendering curves in RenderMan. You could do this with geometry. You don't have to do curves. The reason why I did curves is because they're cheap to render, and they're so small you're not going to really tell that's not geometry. But if you're doing like dirt or pebbles or something like that, then obviously we would be using something else. But on those curves, what you need to do is you need to come over to the curve. So let's go ahead and find that there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to RenderMan. click on render curve. So that's going to make sure it renders the curve. And then you're just going to assign, oops, don't do that. Right click on this, and then you're going to find the shader. So I made a shader dust, and I'm just assigning the dust shading group. This is the thickness of it when it renders. And then, so that's how you enable that. I did that, but you can see that if I select this ground curve, this is one big, so this is something, my setup was a little tricky because one of the problems was I couldn't natively get my materials assigned through Bifrost onto the curves, so I couldn't get that to work. So I actually exported. That's what this cache node right here is. So I baked the geometry and exported it out as a file, Olympic file, and I actually just brought that file back into Maya. So I essentially exported these as an Olympic cache and then just re-imported them. So that way they're not connected to Bifrost anymore, and I can just go in and change the settings and play with them. The problem is it's baked down. So if I make setting changes, like I want to change the scale of them or add more, then I'd have to delete this, rebake it out. But on this, you can see that if I come over, there's like hundreds of shapes. And so I wouldn't want to go to each one of those. You see it's all on, right? Dust shading group, render curve. But actually had to use scripts. So what I did was I just Googled, oh, actually, in this case, I don't have anything. I think this is a new version of Maya, so I don't have my same scripts. But essentially what I did was I Googled how to set the attribute. So first thing I would normally do is, in this case, if I need a batch edit something or a batch change something, is I would look in here. So whenever you do something in Maya, like selecting things, right? You can see when I select things, we get a command. And so that's the command that if I deselect, let's go ahead and copy this, and I just deselect that object, right? And then I'm just going to go over to this Maya environment language. I'm just going to paste that little command that I copied from up there. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And you can see it does the thing I did in the viewport, which was select those guys, right? And so if I took these guys and I moved them up, let's see, actually, I can't see where they're at. So let me go ahead and move something else. I'll just move this leaf. So I'll move this leaf up. And so we'll just Control Z that back. And then if I just, again, come over here with that selected, and I just type in and then run the command right here, you'll see it repeats that command. So knowing that, I could now programmatically select a bunch of objects and apply settings. So what I did was I went here, grabbed this curve, went to one of the shapes, went to RenderMan. I enabled render curve, and so you can see it says set attribute, the name of the object, and then this is the attribute name, RenderMan render curve. And so one is true or on, so I turn that on. And the same thing with here, I did with the shading group. I just went ahead and assigned that shading group. Let's go ahead and break that connection really quickly. So we'll just right click and say dust shading group. And so you can see it's now I have this other one called connect attribute. So I'm going to need connect attribute, and I'm going to need set attribute. Okay. And so I'm going to go ahead and get this fixed so that you guys don't have to watch me do this and figure it all out again, and then I can explain it. Okay, here's my basic setup. So what I did was, because I have an object, so let's go ahead and disable that. I have this object, and I want to assign this setting. So it's on the shape node is where this RenderMan setting that I need is, right here, right? The actual object itself is going to be this. And so you can see there's not a setting for that material on the object itself. It's on the shape. So I need the shapes, but you can see the only way to select the shapes is to use something like this, or you can select by name, and you can type in the name. An easier way to do that would be to come in here and go to display and enable shapes. So if I open this up, it's going to be a lot, but you can see it's going to list all the shapes, so I can actually select the shapes inside the object. I'm going to select all of them, and then I'm just going to execute this. I don't want to do that right now because it's going to take a long time because I have like 5,000 of these curves. But the main idea is if I would first test it out on a single one. So we're just going to go to RenderMan. I'm going to go ahead and change this to something else and disable that. And then with that selected, that shape, you can see when I click on this, it goes ahead and repeats that action I had done earlier on this object because I turned it into a little bit of code. And I can do that on multiple objects, right? And the way that works is I have this little function in here. So I just created a new, so I just copy pasted my commands that I would need. And then I went over here, started a new mail tab by clicking on this. So just create a new script. And then I actually found this online. So usually what I'll do is I'll Google mel, which is mel, select a bunch of objects and change attribute, right? And so then I just use that as a basis. So the thing that it came with was essentially I have this array of object names. So it's assigning this. And so it's essentially, this is the command for grabbing or calling the identity of what you have selected. So if I have multiple things like these four selected here, if I ran this command right here would take those four names and store it into this array. And then I'm just doing a for loop for each element in that array. And this is $object is the current element. So it's going to go through 4 times if I have 4 objects in there. And it's going to run these two commands on each object. So the first one is that connect attribute, which is assigning the material. That's the one that I got when I assigned the material. I needed, with that one, I needed dust shading group dot message is the thing that I'm going to keep. And then this curve shape 5329 is going to be different for each object, right? Like each object has a different name, right? So if I did that on this one, so if I came over and let's go ahead and break that connection and I'm going to run dust SG, you can see it's a different name. Curve shape 18, but the rest of it's the same. So that's the part that needs to be replaced each time it runs through. So what I did is just copy paste that over, and then I just took that custom or connected right here, and I went ahead and kept the forced dust sg.message, everything the same, and I just replaced the normal name with this right here. So I put the name of the object with just by calling that variable plus, which is just going to concatenate these two strings because this is a string, the rest of that. And then so each object's going to come in and it's going to replace the curve shape 18 with 19, 20, 30, 40, et cetera, et cetera. And then similarly, this one's a little bit simpler. I just did the same thing with setting the ability to render curves and just setting it to 1 because by default it's set to 0 or off. So I just batch ran that on my curve selections, and so that way they were all done. So that was a lot for a very specific thing, but the power of being able to have like some tools in your belt of like solutions to handling like a large amount of objects or data and going through them, right? Because you're not going to be able to go through 5,000 objects and manually set those because that's going to be such a pain. So being able to do some of these things and just having a little know-how of how to, like, I couldn't from memory write this because I just don't use Mel that often. But I understand it enough that I can find online a script and then make it my own, like edit it so it fits my needs and then apply it to here. And so that's how I got it. And then the only difference is since I'm rendering hair, I think I do the same thing for my fuzz for XGen. You don't have to do this, but there are hair shaders. So if I come, oh, this got a little messy. If I come over to dust, I'm actually using a different shader. So there's this shader called Llama, so Llama Surface. It's a material that certain studios use, like I think ILM uses it, and RenderMan has the shader inside of RenderMan. It's a little bit more complicated than Pixar Surface, so I wouldn't recommend you guys use it by default. But what I can do is I can plug in different components of a shader to this thing right here. So I'm going to do this thing called Llama Ching. Let's do Ching, hair Ching. And then I'm just going to plug this into Material Front. And so this is going to render something like a hair shader. So it's just going to have certain properties to it so it renders more like hair. So you can see I just plug that in. It also has this, there's a hair color node, so I can just manually set the color of the hair. It's a little technical, so again, you don't have to do it. There's also, if you just want to stick to basic shaders, there's not that basic, but there's a Pixar Marshner hair. So that one doesn't require Llama. So you just can just use this is like a Pixar surface practically. You can just plug this guy into the appropriate settings. And I just assign that material through either XGen or through, like, if for the fuzz, I just went to XGen, went to preview output and assign the shader there. And then for the dust, since it's not through XGen, I could just I just went to the attribute editor. Since they're curves, I went down to this attribute editor and assigned the shading group there. If this was geometry, right, and then it would be a very similar process where you could just select all the objects and just right click and assign shader. Okay, for the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a few of the lighting and rendering things. So a couple tricks to make things go faster. I talked about XPU, so you might have to update your RenderMan to the newest one, 27, came out a few days ago, and so it's meant to be for production now. So you should be able to, it should have most of the features, but like I said, it doesn't have XGen yet. So that makes iterating really fast. Oops, gets kind of close. But that makes iterating really, really fast and just moving things around, scooting them around, and adjusting settings without having to restart your render every single time. Another thing is if you come over to your render settings, so we'll come over to render settings and go to features. Actually, let's go to sampling. So a couple things to look out for is max indirect bounces. This is usually one of the factors for how long each render pass takes, is because each ray that it's casting or path it's tracing is essentially, this is how many different surfaces each one bounces off of at a max before it stops. So you could reduce this number to something like 4, and so that would make your renders faster. The only downside is there's diminishing returns, but if indirect lighting and ambient lighting, so like light bouncing off a table and hitting like the bottom of this object, things like that, those rely on indirect bouncing, and a lot of shading does. So if you bring it too low, then sometimes you'll just lose certain effects of shading or rendering and lighting, like indirect lighting and ambient lighting. Another setting that I call attention to is this setting right here, specular depth and diffuse depth. If you are using glass and you notice your glasses are looking dark, then you might need to change this setting a little bit higher. And just be careful, you don't want to go crazy like 20 because it's usually not necessary. But if you have like glass in front of glass in front of glass, then it's a good idea to increase the setting. And this one, diffuse, is the same idea, but for materials that are single scatter or subsurface scattering. So if you, again, notice that your subsurface scattering or your single scattering are looking artificially dark or not getting enough light, then you might want to change this setting. Okay, coming over to sampling up here, another setting is when you're running IPR. So that's when you come over to RenderMan and you click the IPR button. These settings right here is what it uses. So it uses a thing called pixel variance, which is like essentially how fine of a tooth comb it uses for each render pass. And the higher the number is, the looser it is, or the more rough it is, but the faster it goes. And then max samples is going to be how many times it will run over a part of your image or a pixel to calculate it, right? And so 64 is pretty low. But you'll see up here, there's different settings. And so these different settings are actually what happens when you click on this render button or when you do a batch render. And so same thing, min samples and max samples. You can see this one's higher. If you come over here, there's default settings. So you can see, I'm not going to do that, but it's going to change this. And these are powers of 2. It's a good idea to keep these ones powers of 2. They are just by default. So that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, and so on and so forth. Like I said, pixel variance, the lower is the more accurate, but slower goes. So you can see when I do a normal render, that's a little, that's a smaller number. Incremental means that it's going to go ahead and go through the whole image, and it's going to essentially give a pass over everything and then go for another pass on each thing. So usually I think this is on by default, and it's a good idea to leave it on because that's going to essentially give you the ability to see your image very quickly instead of just seeing like line by line by line scan line rendering um, pixels showing up, which can be a lot slower for if you're sitting there just trying to get a setting back. I do have a open color IO setting with ACES 1.2, which gives me the ACES rendering environment. Um, if you run into it and you do run ACES, first thing I would recommend is check out and be careful for, by default, the viewport renderer is going to give you something that looks like this. It's super punchy and glowy, and you'll be like, that looks so different. And that's just the default that it switches to. I don't know why that's the default, but ACES 2065-1 isn't meant to be viewed on your monitor. It's supposed to store a huge color range, and it's for archival purposes. What you want to do is you want to, and you can find this also on under View, Image Color Space, ACES, if you're in ACES. And then you just switch over to ACES CG. ACES CG is going to be closer to what you're expecting to render or look in when you're working with linear sRGB. So by default, you're using linear sRGB when you don't have that on, but I turned on ACES, so I'm rendering with ACES CG. The other thing I'd have to keep in mind there is I'd also have to make sure my texture maps are being converted correctly. So if whenever you do ACES, you'll see in here there's this color space, and well, anytime you bake your texture map, and then your color maps, like my diffuse color, it's going to have a color space sRGB texture that just says it already has an sRGB texture coming in color space setting, and so it's going to convert it to ACES for me, so you can see it's converting it. And then things that aren't color maps that are meant to be seen are coming in as data maps. I mean, same thing. So you just want to double check those, and usually you can run parse scene, and that's going to go through and see if there's any new texture maps that need to be converted and do it for you. And so usually that's a good idea whenever you're importing new texture maps for the first time, that you go through and double check all that. All right. The other things I was going to talk about is for my lighting. Pretty straightforward. I actually have just 3 lights. So I have my dome light, which is my environment light. Let's go ahead and get a render started. And so we're just going to go ahead and run IPR. Beautiful thing about the XPU is that it's going to update very quickly. The downside is that it's going to usually has a bit of a slow start. So getting the initial render to start takes a little bit of time, but that's not uncommon. And the more complex and the more geometry you have in your scene, the more that's going to happen. But here we go. So you can see it's resolving pretty quickly. If you want to see your image even cleaner and you're getting a bunch of noise, so I go ahead and turn off recent bucket. So let's see, where is it? Recent bucket markers. So every time you like, oh, okay, mine's not actually showing it. But usually when you'll have these blue little buckets that show up, and so essentially it's just showing you like as it iterates and refreshes and samples your image, you're just getting these like little bucket. It's essentially groups of pixels that it's sampling and doing at a time. But in my opinion, while I'm working, it gets in the way. I don't really like it. So then what you can also do is if you feel like the noise, especially if it's kind of slow, it's hard to get a sense of the look of your image. You can come into view and click on denoise. And for right now, it's not doing anything, but you'll see, oh, I might have to restart the render. Let's go ahead and restart it. And just to let you know, some things you actually also have to close IT, the image tool, this render view, in order for them to take effect. So one of those things would be if you change your color space midway through your project, right? So if you turn on ACES, you'll probably have to close this and reopen it. Ooh, wrong one. Let me go ahead and pause this. Okay, the denoising for some reason isn't working. Maybe again, it's one of those things where the real-time denoiser doesn't work with XPU. I'm not sure. I might be just missing a setting. But when you do the denoiser, what it does is essentially looks at your image whenever you have like noise and sampling errors, things like that. And what it'll do is it'll average out and like predict what a pixel's true final color or is supposed to be. And usually that can give you a really good idea for color and lighting, right, of your scene, right? Because you're not getting a bunch of like little black spots on there, which can really change how things look or your impression of them. But the problem is it will wash out your textures until the image finishes resolving. Okay, let's take a look at my lighting. So like I said, my lighting's very simple. I have this dome light, which is just used for my fill. And so that's just providing my fill. It does have this like side light that's coming through. So this key light, that's this like blue hit that's coming over from the side. But it's mostly just used for fill. This light over here is to enhance that blue effect. So I really liked that blue edge light coming in. Let's go ahead and hide the other lights so we can just see what's happening. So this is my HDRI. I'm just using it for some fill. But I usually start with my key light. So we're going to start with the key light. So here's my key light, and it most likely started a lot brighter than this and had a lot more spread to it. But the thing I liked was as you can see in my render, is eventually I kind of get it to kind of only spotlight here, almost like it's a desk lamp, and then having more light coming in from like a window or something like that. So here's my key light. I just have some pretty basic settings on it, but I am keeping in mind that the placement of my light is going to be affecting the overall direction and shape of my shadows and light structure. So I almost always have my key light at a 3/4 angle. I rarely will have it like front and center. And when I say front, I mean like according to the camera. Let's see if I can actually aim this at something. Ooh. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to avoid frontal lighting, which that kind of looks cool, but it gives it the effect of flash photography where you're looking through a flashlight, right? And so I'll do 3/4 and or a side lighting, but the main idea is I have a light side and a shadow side, and it helps make your object feel a little bit more dimensional. To control it, since I'm using a rectangle light, what I'm going to do is I could use a spotlight. Actually, I don't know if they have a spotlight anymore. But what we can do is we come over to refine. There's this cone angle. So the cone angle is what lets me control where the light's showing up. This is actually really handy, so I can lose light on the background and control it and not have it hit that back wall, right? But especially not calling too much attention. Like I want this guy to be, you can see the denoising showing up on that image for some reason. Um, but yeah, so by being able to like control that cone angle, that really helps me control like where the attention's at, right? The softness is just going to be, you can see there's like a bit of a blur transition, but if I got rid of that, you can see there's like a harsh edge transition. So that cone softness is just to get a fall off on it. I'm adding something called an IES profile. So if you're going to have artificial lights or lights coming through objects, these are really handy. Let's go ahead and go over to here. And so I'll go ahead and drag over here. And we're going to look for IES profile, RenderMan. Okay. So there's actually these IES profiles, and you can add them to the RenderMan preset library, which comes installed with RenderMan. But let's say a flashlight video game. I'm just trying to think of something that would be easy to show. So, or actually, let's see, flashlight, dark room. So you can see when light is being cast on this object, the distribution of light is not constant, right? It's not uniform. It doesn't follow like a really nice gradient or shape. And so that's what the IES profile is. It's supposed to simulate different sorts of objects that cast light and cast them in non-uniform. Looks like a CG in non-uniform ways. And so that's what the IES profile is meant for. Simulate that. So I just added one of those on just to add a little bit more texture to my artificial light. And so that just, it's a very subtle effect, but it can be pretty helpful to make your light feel a little bit more natural. All right, so that's my key light. The only other thing to keep in mind is the size and distance. So distance of your object, or your light object. So if I come over here, let's just go Command, Snapshot, no AOV. Just keep in mind where your light source is in terms of distance from the object. So if I pull this, I'm just going to pull the exposure down a little bit to closer match how bright it was from farther away. So here we go. It might not be super noticeable to everybody, but the main thing is you can see the light levels aren't that different here and here on this backpack, but you'll see the amount of light that's hitting this object in the background is changing a bit, right? This was pretty insignificant of a change, but this is calling what's called this follows what's called the inverse fall off rule. And so if your light source is essentially really close to something, it gets significantly more light than something that is just a few meters away. But when your light source is really far away, so let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the cone angle for a second so I don't have to worry about that. We'll bring this up 12. Let's set that to maybe 8. And I'm just going to pull that up so I'm not casting that shadow. All right. And so on this case, you can see, again, the light levels are different, of course, but you'll see like the amount of light that's hitting here in this back part of the table and here is like exactly the same. So when your light source is far away from something, the change in light from one spot to another is very insignificant. But when your light source is really close to the object, the amount of light that changes from the closer object to a farther object is very noticeable. So that's what's called inverse fall off. So usually it's a good idea to try to make your light source relatively the same distance as you think it should be for in real life. So if I'm doing that desk lamp, right, like it made sense for my light object to be right here, right? Because you could have a desk lamp there. But if you're trying to simulate the sun, right, like this is not going to feel like the sun because our eyes and our brains can tell this isn't natural for the sun. So just keep that in mind when you're choosing your light sources. The other thing is the size of my object is also going to be changing some things. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to set this to 4, and we're just going to move this back. Okay, I don't actually know where this was originally. Control Z, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. There we go. I think this is it. All right. And you can see I'm also doing things like using cards to flag off, right? This is just me manually like removing light right here because without that, I get more light right there. And it was just getting too hot and I wanted to pull the attention right there. I could also point the light there, but there's various reasons why I do it that way. But you'll see I'm using a lot of light blockers. They're just to prevent light from different sources from hitting things. But yeah, okay. So the size of the light source, like its physical size, also changes a lot of things, right? So if we're just, let's not pay attention to the light that's sitting back there. But if I scaled this up, right, pay attention to the shadows on this body. So we'll just go ahead and command snapshot no AOVs. And then I'm just going to take that same thing. I'm just going to scale it down really, really tiny. And obviously I'm getting like some like barn door cone angle stuff. But if I come down here and compare, right, you can look right in here, but you'll notice that when the light source is smaller, you get really hard shadows. And when the light source is bigger, you get much softer shadows. And so when your light source is small relative to the object, it's going to show up as the light is going to give you really hard shadows. But if you make the light source bigger, it's going to give you softer shadows. Okay, so we had that key light. Let's go ahead and bring back my key lights. Nope, that's the kicker light. So got the key light. And so the environment light or my dome light I'm just using it purely for fill. So I just brought in a dome light. I brought in HDR. I found an HDR that I liked off of the internet. There's plenty of free ones, just loaded it on. It's interior of a house because I wanted mine to feel like it was inside. I desaturated it because by default it came in with like color, right? So it has this color, but I wanted kind of like the outside to be like blue, like the light coming in from like day sky. So what I did is I just desaturated it and then I turned on, which if I desaturate it's just going to be neutral, right? Just white. But then I enabled color temperature and just set a higher value to give me like a cooler color tint. And I could have just done it with this, but I don't want to. And then I'd play with the exposure. And then like the angle is going to be really important, right? Because there's going to be, depending on the HDRI, essentially like a key light in it or a main light source. And so in this case, it's going to be that window that's open. And so I rotated and put it in a way that it's like back here, coming from back behind the object. If I got rid of this, oops, let's see if I got rid of these guys. If we can see the effect on the models. It's not that significant, but it's coming from back here and hitting these guys. And then I have those blockers to control and shape the lighting. And then, like I said, I liked kind of like what was happening on part of these reflections coming from that backlight. And so I just added an enhancement where I just essentially added this extra light that kind of has that cool color temperature, same color temperature. And I just positioned it so I would get some like nice reflections on the leather. Okay, next is to talk about depth of field. So I actually have really subtle depth of field, but you can see this gets out of focus in the background. It's a little bit less obvious in the foreground, but these guys aren't as sharp. My focus is right here. My camera is right here. So if I come and take a look at that, what I did was I created a distance tool. And so what I did was I just went up here and went to create measuring tools, distance tool. And then what you can do is you click on two objects. So if I held V, so it'd snap. So I clicked on this guy, and then I went ahead and held V and clicked on like a surface on my object. And you can see it gives me a measurement of 124. And you can like set this up with expression, so you can like move the camera and always get a new number and plug it into the right thing. But the main idea is I use that because I was turning on depth of field. So if we come over to my camera and I come down to depth of field, right? Let's go ahead and disable depth of field. You'll see this thing in the background becomes very sharp. It's going to just take a little bit to. So, and the only reason why it wouldn't be sharp is because of rendering noise and it being in shadow. But the shapes are very, let's see if we can find an example here. Nope, let's go ahead and grab this one. Let's see. Okay. So you can kind of see how that blurs out quite a bit in the background, including this guy right here. He gets a little bit blur. So that helps us with the lighting. It helps us draw our attention away from the background. I could exaggerate more if I wanted to, but essentially enabling depth of field. Focus distance is going to be what's going to be in focus. So I just used 120 or 121 to keep the backpack in focus. F-stop, the lower the number, the more exaggerated your depth of field is. So if I go ahead and we're just going to take this, we're going to command snapshot, no AOVs, pull that down here. And then on this one, if I go ahead and bring the f-stop down to like something crazy low, like 2, right, you can see that's really, really exaggerated. So you got to be careful with depth of field. It can be really cool camera effect, right? It gives you the feeling that it's like this object sits in real life and is shot with a real camera, right? Because that's something that cameras do. But it can change the sense of scale and reality if you use the wrong depth of field. Because by using this f-stop of 2 and having a super heavy depth of field, it kind of feels very artificial and it kind of gives it this miniature feeling. So I kept it pretty subtle where I just wanted to lose sharpness in the background. I can go maybe lower if I really need to, but I wanted to lose some focus in the background and just give us that like little attention right here. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is this fog volume, which I don't actually use most of the time, but I did want to include it because some of you guys might find it helpful. So this is just a box that I've added to the scene. I didn't really need to close that. So this box I added to the scene is just a cube. And then what I did was I took it while it was selected and I just, oops, not that. I came over here and I clicked on this button right here, volumes. And so let's go ahead and let's turn off shapes. And we're just going to go ahead and see if I'm just going to delete that Pixar volume. Let's do this. Actually, so I'm going to come up here, select by name, and then we're just going to do Pixar volume 1. So it selects it and I'm deleting it. All right, so let's go ahead and I have this. Let's go ahead and restart that render. And so I have this box, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach a volumetric render to it, or shader. And so what that's going to do is it's going to treat this as a volumetric object. So it's going to fill it essentially with particulate matter, and then not have a standard surface like a 3D model, right? Most 3D models with the Pixar surface or any shader are essentially going to be flat, thin objects with a hard surface or an opaque surface or transparent surface. But a volumetric shader is going to let light into it. So here, what we're going to do is we're just going to select this object, and I'm just going to go to Create Pixar Volume. You don't have to use a box. You could bring in what's called VDBs. So VDBs are volume, I don't know what it stands for, but probably volume database or something like that. But that's essentially like three-dimensional point cloud sort of, like if you made like a fog or a cloud object in Houdini, you could bring that in and render it. Because you can see this doesn't really quite have texture. So coming to this Pixar volume, again, don't want to go into too many settings, but the ones that I was playing or keeping an eye on is emissive, so making sure I don't have emissive. And then this setting right here, this density float is going to be how dense the fog is, right? So you can see as I'm bringing that value lower, 0.002. Probably go pretty dang low, 0.0005. If it'll let me. I don't know if it will. Okay. I'd have to, I don't know if I can go any lower than that. But yeah, so just playing around with these settings. Like I said, I don't know Pixar volume like inside and out, but this would be one of the first ways that you can add essentially like light shafts and shadows in your scene. So if I came in and I went ahead and added in let's see, we're going to go ahead and do a disk light. And I'm just going to go ahead and rotate it to point down. Let's go ahead and scale it up a bit so I can see it. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull it back into the fog. And let's see if we can see it show up. And we're just going to go ahead and crank the exposure a bit. And then let's go ahead and do advanced. And then we're just going to go ahead and use, oops, not advanced, we're fine. And we'll just use our cone angle to kind of narrow that down. So anyways, you can get that kind of concept of cast shadowing. Let's go ahead and turn off the other lights for a second so you can see this a little bit better. Right, and so essentially, like normally you can only see the light source hitting the object. You can't really see a presence of the light source like atmosphere. But this can give you the illusion of atmosphere though, at the cost of it being more expensive. So anyways, hope that helped. There's a lot of random little things that I did in my scene. And it's just a lot of it is just adding little bits to make things feel a little bit more believable, lived in, eclectic. There's just like little details like being able to scatter pieces of geometry and little bits, things like that. Adding small texturing details really goes a long way to making a surface an object feel believable. But yeah, that helps.